frame this up, and it's the way we have intended to frame the legislation implementation process all along, is that we're talking about accessibility for everyone, and we're really clear that disability rights are human rights. It's not a separate category unto itself, but it's really important for us to recognize disability rights as human rights. So we go to the next slide, Jen. You're going to see what we would call the international symbol of access, or international symbol of accessibility. I'm going to assume you've all seen this at some point in your travels. Would I be correct?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I wanted to share this not because of what it symbolizes actually, but what I think it often doesn't symbolize, or what it tells us about gaps in accessibility in general. So clearly we know that this is supposed to point us to accessible spaces, whether it's parking spaces or the built environment. It's clearly supposed to be a symbol of access. I think that what we have learned through experience, through research, through history, is that one of the things this actually symbolizes is the extent to which accessibility is not commonplace, and the extent to which we actually have to symbolize that something is accessible, because the sort of common everyday state of being would be that things are not accessible. And I think also what we know is that while we often put this up to point to accessibility, it's often an indicator of only partial accessibility. So we may, for example, have an accessible door that has a door opener, and then you get inside the first set of doors and there's no way to get in through the second set of doors. Or you get in through that set of doors and then you're face to face with a set of stairs. So I think that it's really important for us to think about, as we're trying to consider who has access and who doesn't, that this sign doesn't always tell us what we think it's supposed to tell us. Okay, can we go to the next one, Jen?
Sure. Go ahead.
So this next slide is one of my favorite sort of cartoon images that really, I think, succinctly shows us what ableism is and how it kind of lives in our everyday world related to community access and more pointedly, probably community inaccessibility. And I really think if we're going to be able to create good, robust, comprehensive accessibility plans, we have to be able to do that thinking carefully about what ableism is and how it shows up in our everyday lives, and most pointedly, the everyday lives of people with disabilities. And so this cartoon where we, have somebody shoveling the stairs and the ramp, and clearly attending to the stairs first and saying we'll get to the ramp once the stairs are shoveled and everybody can get into the stairs, tells us all of the ways that we are not prioritizing access for disabled people or for all people, but in fact thinking about abled people first and ensuring they can all get in the building first, when in fact if we simply shoveled the ramp, clearly everybody could get in anyway. So and I know it seems like an obvious thing to shovel the ramp first, but you'd be shocked at how often we don't do that, or maybe you wouldn't. And it's probably really unfortunate if you're not at all shocked. So that's sort of my, one of my favorite cartoons that kind of points us to ableism and what it looks like. And that's the really obvious depiction of ableism at work, but it happens in all kinds of other ways that we really need to learn to be attentive to as we think about doing the work of developing accessibility plans. All right, so the next slide, please, Jen. So there are a number of ways that we can think about ableism and really should think about ableism and what it is and how it shows up in our everyday lives. And the first is ableism as discrimination. So clearly ableism is about discrimination, and it's discrimination or prejudice against disabled people or in favor of abled people. It's sort of that system that privileges those who move through the world and interact with the world in normative, non-disruptive ways, I guess is what I would say. It's about ideas and assumptions, stereotypes, attitudes and practices, physical barriers in the environment, or larger scale oppression. So it happens sort of at the individual level, and it happens systemically. Basically, the unexamined belief that it's better to walk than roll, it's better to speak than sign, it's better to read using your eyes than using technology. So it's all of those ways that we discriminate against people who identify as having disabilities because we think it's better to not have a disability, essentially. Okay, next slide, please, Jen. The next slide is ableism as ability preference, and clearly this is variation on a theme, but it helps us sort of think through all of the ways we encounter ableism. So it's a general preference for ability over disability. So a general societal preference. Ability is good, desirable. Disability is bad, unwanted, undesirable. And it also shows up in a preference for particular disabilities and the devaluation of some disabilities more than others. It's really about a disability hierarchy, and often that hierarchy is constructed and reinforced by abled people. So we see clearly that ableism shows up in our preferences for groups of disabled people who can best approximate normalcy, or whose ways of being and engaging in the world are least disruptive to abled people and systems that just don't expect us as disabled people. So the next slide, please, Jen, is called Ableism as Enforced Normalcy. So this is where we see ableism as a really deeply embedded sort of set of beliefs and practices that center normalcy as that standard to which clearly all disabled people must want to aspire. It's that aspirational state of being. It expects all disabled people to strive for normalcy as a sign of growth, as a sign of development, as a sign of success. So essentially it has us as disabled people doggedly pursuing normalcy, disavowing disability, and assigning greater value to those quote unquote disabled people who overcome their disabilities. Okay, so next slide, Jen, please and thanks.
Yep.
So why is any of this important? I know in some ways it seems like all of the theoretical mishmash that academics like to throw at people, but I think it's actually really important when we're trying to think about what it's going to mean to foster accessible communities over time and what it means to develop a plan so that we can get there. It really requires us to think about accessibility as not just being something that's specific to particular categories of disability. So for example, it's really common to only think about accessibility in terms of ramps and elevators and wheelchairs, when in reality we have a diversity of disabled people who have been prevented from participating in community in all kinds of ways for, you know, multiple years and decades. And so we have to think beyond the kinds of equipment that get us indoors and think about all of the things that, you know, support participation in all aspects of community, sort of the notion of living and learning and working. Accessibility also isn't the responsibility of particular groups of individuals, and it's certainly not the responsibility of disabled people themselves. So often we are tasked essentially with advocating for our own access, which clearly sends the message that our participation is provisional, that we're not expected, and that potentially we're too much work. So we really have to think about accessibility being everybody's responsibility. We all need to work to get there. So accessibility is about everyone. And we need to be able to think really broadly about who everyone is and who is and isn't participating. Okay, so next slide is creating a plan. So when I was thinking about what it means to create an accessibility plan, because interestingly enough, that's not the piece of work that I'm doing, at least not at this point, I thought, you know, it's really about minding all of the gaps in accessibility. We have to be attentive to all of the ways that people are not supported to participate in the everyday life of community. So who's missing, who's not in our activities, and whose voices are missing from all of the processes that are part of us thinking through what our community life is going to look like. So, you know, if disabled voices aren't at all tables, then our voices are missing. So we don't need to just be at the accessibility tables, but in order for us to really think in a robust, complete way about what accessible communities look like for everybody, then we have to be at all tables, not just the disability related ones. Mm-hmm. Who are we excluding in theory? So theoretically, we have to think about who might want to be there that isn't there. Who is excluded in policy? So for example, really common to see kind of equity and diversity and inclusion policies that actually say nothing about disability, that they tend to focus on race and gender identity, all of which are vitally important, of course, but disability is also a really important category of diversity. We aren't just people, you know, who need help and need support and need a ramp and need a wheelchair and need a sighted guide. And then just in practice, what are the gaps in our everyday practice that are preventing people from participating? Are there ways that we don't have good equipment so that people can participate in all of the activity that's available in our trail system? Are there ways that you know, we can't bike because we don't have any adaptive equipment? So we want to think about all of the things people want to do and who's missing from all of that work. And then slide 9, which is my last slide, and hopefully we can engage in some conversation, is about aiming for excellence. So I think so often when we talk about accessibility and improving accessibility, there has been a tendency over many years and many decades to sort of aim for the baseline. Make sure we meet the minimum standard. But what we know is that the minimum standard still doesn't make it possible for everybody to participate. So aiming for excellence really means that we make participation in community possible for a broad spectrum of individuals. So you want to think ahead and anticipate a diversity of participants so that you're ready for them. So we can't settle for meeting minimum standards, and we can't settle for just physical access. We have to think about all categories of disability and what it means to make sure our spaces and events are welcoming for everyone. And it's really going to mean for leadership, particularly ongoing education. So it's always about examining and re-examining. So this work is never done. You know, the daily work of equity, which is the work I do, is never done. I'm always learning, I'm always re-examining, I'm always examining my own assumptions, and not just looking at environments, but really taking the time to think, gosh, are the things that I thought were true really true? And I'm always working to do that by ensuring I center the voices of people who live in equity every day. So all of the ways that my voice, particularly as a white settler woman, for example, carries with it all kinds of privilege, means that I need to not be the one centered, and I need to be drawing on the lived expertise of Indigenous and Black activists who have much to teach me. Certainly as a disabled activist, then my voice needs to be at the table related to disability issues. And that's really about that complete and ongoing education that centers first voice, that examines and re-examines assumptions, and ensures on a daily basis that access for all is a top and ongoing priority. So we're not going to create a plan and get there, and I'm sure you all know that. And it's certainly why the plans have to be revised and re-examined, I think, every 3 years. So that's all I have in terms of presentation, but certainly happy to engage in some conversation. I'm sure that you are all sort of starting to think this through.
Is it okay if I stop sharing?
Sure. Thanks so much
No problem.
for solving that accessibility glitch. One of my days. Generally not the only one.
No, not at all. Oh, thank you, Cynthia. My gosh, I'm like almost in tears. Sorry here, but
Oh.
no, in a good way. In a good way. Your cartoon, I love that. I was at a meeting one time and they were talking about a restaurant, and they were like, "Well, we can put the ramp out back," and I'm like, "Well, why don't you put it out back? Put the stairs, because I can go up down a ramp even though I'm not in a wheelchair." So I love that cartoon. Is fabulous.
Well, and accessibility doesn't mean backdoor access.
No,
it means we get to go in the front door like everyone else.
Absolutely.
Because we are as important as everyone else.
And the point you made about normalcy being the goal, I know in my own life that is not how I view the world, and I know many people on this committee don't view it that way, but sadly I think you're right, in society we do. We normalcy at the top of the chain and think that's where we have to be, and miss so many people that are never going to be in that. And who said
well, and we just had this discussion interestingly with my students, and you know, as I was reading some of their submissions to me at one point, I thought, oh, you know, I've missed the mark here on something, because so I need to go back and get it with them, because they kept saying, really, everybody's normal is different, and there is no normal. And I thought, but there is, right? In our daily reality, there is a normal. It has power, and it is preferred.
Yes, it is.
And those of us who don't fit in that normative box are the ones who are constantly fighting for access. And I think the other thing that I often hear is, well, we just really need to teach people to self-advocate. And I think what we really are saying when we do that is that we just have to teach people that we're not going to look after their access needs. They need to ask us first.
Yes, I agree, Cynthia, and that's totally backwards. I'm with you on that. It's a human right. It should be all our rights to have full accessibility to our publicly funded institutions, no matter if we are visually impaired or we're hearing impaired or any which way. Ableism is very much alive in our communities, sadly.
It is.
It is alive. And
it's alive and well.
But I see it every day. I'm able-bodied, and I cringe sometimes when I'm in places, and I think about, this shouldn't be this difficult. It shouldn't be this difficult. And we know there's work ahead of us. I know education of people and individuals in the community, to me, that's a major thing that we're going to have to try to achieve, so that people understand.
Yeah, and I think public education will certainly have to be a significant part of any plan, because I think that we're not, you know, we're getting a lot better around physical access in all kinds of ways, although we still see it as a frill in some respects. And there are all kinds of ways that we look to get out of doing work that might be costly. But where we're not so great is we're not very good at thinking, for example, about deaf and blind spaces. We're not good at all at thinking about spaces that are welcoming for neurodivergent people.
Yes.
And, you know, making space for autistic kids and adults to thrive in our communities alongside us, to be part of our communities.
Exactly. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
I think the normalcy thing struck me in terms of Lamont.
Yes.
And think of it in different ways, because he still has gifts to offer.
Of course.
And listening to young people whom he was with all his life that still come to him to talk because he listens.
Of course.
And he's very good at minimal feedback, but also you have to allow yourself to think of, you have to like have permission to know that you're normal. He's normal, you know. Because
well, Lamont is Lamont, right? It's the same as I am me, and
this gift that he has was the strength that he always had.
Right.
And he continues to be able to have that.
Right.
To contribute, but yeah, it's that struck me is that why are we trying to make him any different than what he is? Well, we could work at physical therapy and speech, you know, all kinds of therapies that help, and he gets out of them what you might not expect. Sometimes it's the social aspect.
For sure. Well, and that's actually a really good point, in that we make an assumption that what has to come out of all of those therapies is improved quote unquote functioning according to normative standards. And that's all of the ways that we talk about overcoming disability, and talk about, you know, we have something to offer in spite of disability. And I would say I have something to offer, and Lamont has something to offer because disability, it's all part of who we are. It's all part of the value we bring to the world.
Yes.
And we don't need to frame it in terms of in spite of.
Yes.
I think lots of what I bring is a different way of, I interact differently with the world, and it has something to teach, and it has something valuable to offer.
Yes. Yes. I know even when he was at rehab and there were other men there who had similar injuries, but they still look to him as some kind of an interesting guy, but almost like,
yeah.
I mean, you know, just his personality.
Yeah.
But they seem to have a harder time accepting, and he was able to accept and move on.
Right. You build a new life, for sure. You build a different life.
Yes. Life is life.
Yep.
Yeah. So he has said to the psychologist, she asked him, was he depressed or was he upset or and he said, it is what it is. And if I make a fuss over it, I'm going to make other people unhappy. So I might as well get on with it.
Yeah.
And so he set the bar pretty high.
Yeah. I often say it is what it is, right? It's not anything to
accept it. We better get with it. So yeah, it's been made a big difference just in how we've moved forward. So help other people to see that as normal.
Well, and we have this real sense of disability as tragedy, and I, you know, clearly I think we often grieve the loss of normalcy when that happens, but I still remember my youngest son, who's now 21, but he came home from school one day in, I don't know, grade 7. And he comes in the door, and I can tell by the way he's talking to me, he's got this smirk on his face. And he said, Mom, I told one of my friends today that you were blind. And I said, oh yeah, how'd that go? And he said, he hugged me like someone died. So it really, and we all just laugh, right? I mean, that is what it is in our house. But it was, I thought, yeah, it's so prevalent, the extent to which we think and can't think beyond disability as loss and tragedy and deficit. And, you know, and I think that is part of what hampers our capacity to think fully about who is in our communities that wants to participate. And no, people don't want to hide away.
Hi, Cynthia.
Yes.
It's Jenna here. I'm listening in with Rob. I loved your talk. I just wanted to pick your brain on what strategies you might have for trying to convince building owners in the private sector to adopt some of these accessibility features beyond the minimum, because of course, cost is always a thing. So I think it's tempting for building owners to do the bare minimum because, so I mean, what we sometimes say is you're missing customers, you're missing patrons, but beyond that, what would you recommend for an approach?
Well, I'm usually fairly blunt. I mean, it's simply the right thing to do. Number one, it is about human rights. And by not doing it, you are denying people their right to shop in your establishment or take part in your establishment. You're right, you're losing out on business. 30% of people in Nova Scotia between the ages of 15 and 65 identify as having a disability. That's an awfully large cross-section of people you seem to be willing to leave out. We don't know yet the extent to which the legislated standards will apply to the private sector. So, for example, with respect to education standards, there are a number of bodies that have been prescribed by the government as public sector bodies that wouldn't normally be public sector bodies, and that's universities and colleges. And so I think it's unclear. And I think also it's unclear the extent to which government will be willing to provide some funding mechanisms, because it's a real concern, and we understand that. And so we're urging government to look at funding streams for businesses who do really want to do that work. But I don't know, my general approach, honestly, is to try to develop good relationships with people that allow you to have the conversations about why they need to do this.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I know in our building here, when we moved in, the landlords have been very good to gradually be adding in accessibility features. We even have an adult-sized change table, which is not very common.
No.
But just where like the folks who we see in the clinic here are so diverse in their needs. It's like we have this never-ending laundry list for our landlord. And so I think it will be a challenge where we're going to keep approaching them with a list over the course of years. And like you said, it is kind of a human rights thing to be able to access these buildings. And then you can see the landlord saying, well, I have to justify it to my business partner, or I have to justify it to someone else. And I think what you said about maybe some of the new legislation, if it has teeth to require building owners to implement these things, that will certainly help. Yeah.
Well, and we're just now seeing a ruling out of the UK, for example, about public washrooms, for example, all will have to have adult changing tables and have larger spaces. So we're seeing, sometimes I just want to say, look, I wasn't aware that I had to justify my human rights. And I sometimes I think if you can be very clear like that, people will see it in a different way. One of the things that we've learned quite recently as we start to think through the public education campaign is that I would say 10 to 15% of people don't actually even think that disability rights are human rights. So they don't think about accessibility as a human right. So that's part of the education work that has to be done. And that will have to be done by the municipalities and by the province and by towns. It's just going to be ongoing.
I think maybe another part of it is that because public spaces are so inaccessible typically,
Yes.
the average person doesn't see the amount of disability they encounter it. So I think there's sometimes like a belief that it's such a much smaller portion of the population than it actually is, because we're not usually encountering these populations. And that was something that was, I guess, a realization for our landlord. Was he said, oh, I didn't realize that adults might need a change table.
Right.
I've never seen it. Well, you don't see it because there's no way for them to come into the community.
Exactly. And it's also, you know, there's also no way, because we know that we do have accessible transit, door-to-door transit. It's not terribly affordable.
No.
So, you know, I always think door-to-door transit is great, except even for me, and I'm well employed, it's expensive. It's a massive chunk out of our budget that we just sort of shake our heads and look at. And my husband will just say, yeah, I'll drive you to work. We're not gonna, it's a massive chunk. So there's all kinds of systemic reasons that we're not seeing people in community, and that's why people don't know. So it will very much be about public education, and that'll be everybody's responsibility for sure. We're taking that on at the provincial level, absolutely. But, and I do sometimes shake my head and think, oh my gosh, we have so much work to do.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Cynthia, a little bit.
Yeah, well, we do.
Concept that disability rights are human rights.
Yeah.
And I believe we all have different abilities and disabilities. That's how I roll in life. Truly do. Because
yeah,
we be good at one thing and not good at another. Is that a disability?
Well, what's interesting about that is, and I agree with you 100%. We all have things we do well and things that we don't do well, right? And in all kinds of ways, you know, I have things I don't do well that have nothing to do with blindness. Yeah. But at the same time, I also think it's really important to always name disability and to not gloss over it by just talking about different abilities and, you know, special needs, or however it gets framed up. There's all kinds of euphemisms that we use to frame up disability, but I just think it's really important to name it so that we understand it's important. Disability is an important way of living, and it's an important perspective on life that we shouldn't be devaluing by assigning it another euphemism that just sort of erases it.
Yeah. No, I totally get what you're saying about that. Yeah. Absolutely, for sure. I would never want to minimize. I guess I was just thinking about just name it, if whatever we have, if that's the barrier or what's keeping us from being fully within the community. Right. Name it and move on. Like, don't think that you're less because you don't do the same thing the same way.
Oh gosh, no, I agree with you 100%, right?
Yeah. So,
Cynthia, this is Rachel. I really appreciate your talk as always. You know, I love it when you talk.
Rachel's my fan club.
Yeah, I'm a little bit in her fan club. But the, you know, your comment around making, you know, we have accessible parking spaces, we have accessible door handles, but, you know, like it's one, it's not the norm, and two, there have to be special circumstances versus just starting from the ground up to create an accessible community for all. And just a really interesting way to, it should be a mandatory way, I guess, for community design. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate your comment around, you know, that those of us who are able-bodied, like myself, gendered, you know, white woman, that represent like, you know, it's our responsibility also to get educated and not always depend on folks who are experiencing struggles to educate us. And I think that's such a really important piece. So on that, when it comes to community education, I mean, you've given us some really valuable feedback on the importance of that. And I love this idea of, you know, human rights, human justice, that whole justice lens, which I know I was on a webinar this morning for you know, working to within racialized communities, and it's kind of this in there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there things that are just, you've seen just failures in terms of, like, should we not go a certain space when it comes to educating communities?
This is such a setup.
It was a big setup.
It's a big setup.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Sorry.
no, it's all good. I had this discussion with a colleague yesterday. I said, I'm not raising it, but let's see how this goes.
You knew I was going to.
I totally did. I should have just known. So I am never, and I understand that it's in the toolkit you would have received from the province, but I actually don't ever advocate disability simulations as a way of public education. And I actually don't advocate them for all kinds of reasons. And I've done them in my past life, you know, around simulating blindness, and I've stopped doing them because I have seen the way they actually over time are damaging. So they really damage my relationships with abled people because they make people afraid of disability even more so than they already are. And you're engaging them in this simulated activity that can never duplicate what I experience. I don't experience the same fear they experience every day, but they can't ever, in the 25 minutes they are blindfolded and given a cane, they can't experience the daily discrimination that I live. And so I think it just presents a false sense of what it is we live. Now, not everybody's going to agree with me, and Jerry Post would be one of them, and we have had several discussions about this. And where I come down on this is that it's very, very controversial in the disability community and amongst activists. And so at the very least, we can't be advocating that it's best practice. I would say the other reason I don't advocate it, and I know that the argument in favor of it is, well, it really helps people understand from their perspective what it is to encounter, a curb with no curb cut. And one of the other reasons I object to it, quite frankly, is if I tell you this is a barrier, that should be enough. My voice, my experience, my knowledge, the knowledge of the disability community as a collective should be enough. You should not have to experience it as a white abled man to believe that it's true. What I do think is really helpful to do is to engage as often as you can in education opportunities with first voice expertise. So Rachel, I'm with you 100% that we have to do our own work. But there are also lots of us who do this, quote unquote, for a living. This is the work that I do. So, I see this kind of work as a really useful piece of academic outreach for me. I think it's important to do, and I'm paid to do this work. So it's not like people are always calling on me to volunteer my time that I'm never getting paid for. So I think where the good thinking comes in is that when we're always calling on disabled people to offer their time free of charge, and as I've often said, we do it over and over and over again, and we never actually see much improvement.
I think that's the most damaging piece is asking for engagement and not responding. Yes,
and that happens a lot. And it's been one of the discussions we've had actually in an ongoing way with government lately. Because we've said you have to understand that governments have asked disabled Nova Scotians for decades to come to the table and offer suggestions, and we either never see them meaningfully reflected in any plan, or we see a plan that never comes to fruition. So, but there are lots of us who do this work who are happy to do this work.
So that leads into my second question for you, because I know that this is your life's work. Do you see improvement? Do you have hope with this new legislation?
Yeah, I do have hope, and I do see improvement. It's generally slower than I would like, only because I've been waiting a long time for it. But there's others who have waited longer. But I do see improvement. Some of the places that I do tend to get a little frustrated is the extent to which we can't seem to get disability taken up as a category of diversity. So we talk about diversity and we're always left out of that discussion. that I find very frustrating, because we tend to be relegated to the group of people who simply need help.
Interesting.
And so we're not really a category of diversity. We're just people who need supports and services, right? Which really situates us as people who are burdensome and expensive, right? And troublesome. And I'm troublesome in all kinds of ways, but I would say troublesome in good ways, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I never thought of that, but you're right. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which goes back again to that, you know, having a parking spot here and a door there.
Right. But I do, you know, I do see improvement. There's no question. If there wasn't substantive improvement, I wouldn't be going to a tenure track job at Concordia, right?
Yeah,
that would not, those kinds of things wouldn't be happening if we didn't see good improvement. But we have had such a long way to go. That's, it's, you know, we still have more work to do.
Yeah.
For sure.
Are there, sorry, if anyone else wants to ask a question, go ahead, but do you see really shining examples globally that, you know, you would push us towards just to take a look at?
So funny. That's a really common question. It's a really hard one to answer because we see pockets of really good practice. It's hard to point to a country. Japan has done, they do really interesting accessibility work in terms of, I would say, the built environment, which includes indoors and outdoors. You know, in spite of the UK's sort of more recent abysmal record on human rights and disability rights, they have in the past done some very good work. Maybe not so much lately in the policy realm, but for sure in the built environment. So I just find you have to look around for pockets of really good work being done, because it's hard to point to anywhere, you know, one country that kind of gets it all right.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Anyone else have questions for Cynthia? Or comments?
Just thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yes, thank you for taking of your time and sharing.
Oh, my pleasure, for sure.
Do appreciate it very much. I'm very excited about this committee, Cynthia, to tell you the truth, I really am. And I did appreciate your comment about making sure we invite into our presentations or the committee itself, first voice of Indigenous, First Nations, and those of color. Those are voices truly, and I work with people who have mental health issues, and there's invisible things, economic disadvantage that we don't always see because they're not there. And so I appreciate that you had reminded us about ensuring that we seek those voices. They need to be intrinsically part of this, truly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
because we all live it quite differently.
Yeah, absolutely. We all view the world differently from our lens, and that's a very important lens to also view the world through, about what the important work that we're doing.
Yeah,
to me,
absolutely.
To me, this is like, after I went to the thing that you had, Cynthia, at King's Tech, and I left, and I thought, oh, good. This is like probably one of the most important things I'll be involved with in my lifetime. I truly see it that way, that this is a paradigm shift of how we view the world and how we view each other. And
we hope it is.
I hope it is. I hope it is. It was
we hope that's what happens, for sure.
I was like, oh, there's like-minded people around. You know, there's very few of us, it seems sometimes. So it's nice to
yes, that's always gratifying, isn't it?
Yeah, to know that you're not totally alone in viewing the world that way. So I really appreciate that you took the time to help, you know, put us in check around that. Because to tell you the truth, I really considered about the having a simulation, so to speak. I'm not totally given up on that idea, but I certainly will take your information and mold it in so that it's not negative, hopefully, and more positive. I appreciate your input on that and your point of view. Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
Please let me know if I can be helpful.
Thank you very much for offering that. I think we're very fortunate to have you live close by, and we have Jerry moving in close by. Like, this is, there's some key people within our area that it's terribly exciting.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Have a great day. Thanks for the PowerPoint rescue. Bye.
Take care.